Welcome to the Tazara News Network, an African news network by Africans. What is really happening in South Africa? Why are the black South Africans attacking African immigrants from other countries? To understand why this is happening, you have to have lived in South Africa during apartheid. I told my Nigerian friends 15 years ago that this was going to happen. I was born in Zambia, but like many people from Southern Africa, I lived in South Africa during the apartheid days. I lived in a township called Atteridgeville, which is now a part of Pretoria. In those days, there was separation between white and black people, and the township where we lived in was a blacks-only township. I saw what happened to the black South Africans. I saw what apartheid did to them. Apartheid destroyed them completely. It was the worst crime in one of the worst crimes ever in human history. To truly understand why the black South Africans behave the way they do today, to understand why there's so much violence in South Africa today, you have to have lived there during apartheid. You have to have seen what apartheid did to them, how apartheid destroyed the African culture that we all share. A lot of the people in Southern Africa share the same cultural background and the same languages. My tribe left South Africa in 1823. My tribe had been living in Zambia for 150 years before I was born. If you go to South Africa today and you speak my language, a language which is a Zambian language today, the people in South Africa understand the language completely. They understand what our names mean because our tribe originally came from South Africa. But I guarantee you that the way they behave is completely different from the way any other African behaves, and that is because of apartheid. The Western media will tell you that that the crime in South Africa started after apartheid. That is a lie. There was a great deal of crime in South Africa before apartheid, only it was contained in the black townships. When I first got to South Africa and I asked them when the crime in South Africa started, the South African women told me that the crime in South Africa started in 1973. That is when they lost control of the minds of the young black men in South Africa. Apartheid damaged them to a level where their mothers, their sisters, could no longer control them. That's why the black South Africans behave the way they do. That's why there is so much crime in South Africa. You have to understand that before we talk about what the Western media is now calling xenophobic violence on other Africans. You need to understand what happened to them during apartheid, and that this violence you're seeing in South Africa today is nothing new. They have behaved like this since 1973, and the reason they behave like this is because apartheid was such a brutal system that it destroyed them, and the first thing they destroyed was their culture. Based on infrastructure, South Africa is probably the most developed country in Africa. It basically has first world infrastructure. So the Western media tries to pretend that black South Africans are the most well-off black people in Africa. That is a lie. Black South Africans are among the poorest and among the most uneducated black people in Africa. Everyone who has been to South Africa knows this. The Zambians, the Zimbabweans, the Kenyans, the Nigerians who have been to South Africa understand that apartheid completely damaged these people. That in the last 20 years there's been some improvement in education and things like that. But black South Africans when apartheid ended were extremely poor, and they're extremely poor today. They own nothing in South Africa. A lot of the large corporations from South Africa which are spread out Africa, companies like MTN, ShopRite and things like that, have been destroyed in other African countries. the ShopRite stores, the MTN outlets in my country, in Zambia, and in places like Nigeria, have been looted and burned by the Zambians and the Nigerians and other Africans in revenge for the xenophobic attacks. But guess what, my fellow Africans? The black South Africans do not own a penny of those companies. All those companies they talk about, the big South African corporate giants, are owned by the white people, by the white South Africans, not the black South Africans. The black South Africans are still extremely poor and still extremely uneducated. After apartheid ended, black South Africans expected to live in a land of milk and honey. It was the time of the Rainbow Nation dream, the time of Nelson Mandela. And for some black South Africans, life improved. A black South African middle class arose. Everyone wanted to buy a house in the Midrand, that's a suburb outside Johannesburg. Life was good. Black people got college degrees. We worked hard, but we partied hard as well. My father owned a house in a leafy suburb in Pretoria. My brother worked as an accountant for a big firm, and I worked at a casino. But for millions of black South Africans, especially for those without skills and money, nothing changed for them. Most black South Africans worked as manual laborers, earning very little money. These black South Africans now had to compete with black people from all over Africa as the flood of migrants from other African countries hit South Africa in a big way. The black South Africans, the poor and educated black South Africans, now found themselves competing against the whole of Africa, talking about Zambians, Zimbabweans, Kenyans, and that, my brothers and sisters, is what laid the seeds of what they now call xenophobic violence. In the 1990s, an entire generation of Zambians moved to South Africa, and we were not the only Africans to do so. Now it is time to talk about the Nigerians. I'm a Nigerian for it. I remember when the Nigerians first arrived in South Africa. It was in the late 90s. There is a difference between the Nigerians and all the other African immigrants who moved to South Africa. African immigrants from countries like Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Kenya, and all the other Mozambique, and all the other people who came to South Africa. The difference between us and the Nigerians is based on one fact. The Nigerians had money. The Nigerians were the first black people we met who actually had money. While the rest of us ran around looking for jobs, begging the Mzungu to employ us in their companies, the Nigerians had their own money. They bought buildings. They opened supermarkets. I remember when I had to open an email address. It was a Nigerian who opened up my first ever Yahoo email address at an internet cafe in Johannesburg, owned and run by Nigerians. That Nigerian taught me a lot about the internet and things like that, things which I didn't know, skills which the Nigerians had already acquired. The South African women came to admire the Nigerians. They called them the real African men. This hurt the black South Africans, as the Nigerians took thousands of their women. This caused a lot of friction between the Nigerians and the black South Africans. When a South African woman rejected a South African, the South African said it was because the women wanted Nigerians. And in a lot of cases it was true. The Nigerians established themselves in South Africa very quickly. But there are many types of Nigerians, good and bad, just like everyone else. 99% of the Nigerians who came to South Africa in the late 90s were from the Igbo tribe, and a small minority of them were Beni. Most of the Nigerians who moved to South Africa at the time were criminals, hardened criminals. They sold drugs and they ran a lot of scams. That's how they made their money in South Africa. The Nigerian mafia is the richest criminal organization in South Africa. There are many groups of criminals in South Africa, both local and foreign, but the most well-known are the Nigerians. For most South Africans, these are the only Nigerians they have ever seen. That is why Nigerians are depicted as criminals on South African television. We have spoken to the South African people and told them that you cannot condemn a nation of 200 million people because of the mostly Igbo gangsters in South Africa. But these are the only Nigerians they know. When they say that the Nigerians flooded South Africa with drugs, it is true. I was there. I saw what happened. To stop what the Western media is calling xenophobia in South Africa, we must look at calling xenophobic violence. We must look at the cause of this violence. First of all, as we have discussed, one of the root causes of this violence is apartheid. Apartheid deeply damaged the South African people. Many young South Africans do not know how to behave like normal people. The rape statistics in South Africa are frightening. I saw things in South Africa which I have never seen anywhere else, and I've been to many places. So that is the first thing we must address if we're going to stop what they call xenophobic violence and violence against the South African women and against the South African population in general. Violence on a level which is seen in very few other countries in this world. Very few other countries. So the root cause, of course, is apartheid and the damage it did to the South African culture, the lack of respect for women, the lack of respect for many other things. So this is one of the root causes of what they now call xenophobic violence in South Africa. The violence was already there. Turning that violence against Africans from other countries was not difficult. There was already a great deal of violence. All they did was turn the violence they had been inflicting on the local women and fellow South Africans onto foreigners. So violence in South Africa is nothing new. As I have said, it started in 1973. Now, violence in particular against the other Africans in South Africa, that too must be addressed. And we are all Africans, my brothers and sisters. And if we don't live we're all Africans. And even if you're in the diaspora, we're all members of the global African family. And unfortunately, sometimes we have to tell each other the truth, no matter how hurtful it is. So the other cause of the violence in South Africa, what the Western media is referring to as the xenophobic violence, is the massive flood of other African immigrants, of other Africans that flooded South Africa. They say that there were at least 6 million Africans from other countries who went to South Africa. This put a great deal of pressure on the black South Africans who were just emerging from apartheid and trying to reclaim their economic status in their own country. This made it very difficult for them to survive. I'm not justifying the violence against other Africans. As I have said, I myself am one of those Africans who went to South Africa, and I know why I went there. I'm not going to go into details, but a lot of Africans went to South Africa looking for economic opportunity. So it was the two root causes of what they now call xenophobic violence. One is the violence that was already there due to the corruption that was caused in South African society by apartheid, the destruction of our African culture, which many young South Africans no longer respect. And that is what is causing this violence in South Africa. The second cause of this violence is the massive number of Africans who moved to South Africa after the fall of apartheid. And this caused a great deal of strain, economic strain, on the black South Africans who are just emerging from apartheid, broken, completely broke, and trying to rebuild their lives. South Africa is not the only African country to have been flooded by immigrants from other African countries. Libya during the Gaddafi era, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Angola, and Kenya have hosted millions of Africans from other countries. Over 25 years, millions of Somalis, over the 25 years of the Somali civil war, millions of Somalis have settled in Kenya, and with them went criminals and terrorists. Kenya even tried to close the refugee camps, the Dadaab refugee camp, apparently the largest refugee camp in the world, because they had a problem with terrorists. We cannot look at the violence in South Africa in isolation. This is not a South African problem. It's an African problem. And we cannot dump all the blame on the black South Africans. We are all to blame, and we must accept this truth if we are to fix this problem once and for all. No one was prepared for the flood of Africans that went to South Africa after the end of apartheid in the mid-90s. By the time South Africa gained independence in 1994, on average, Africa had been independent for 31 years. My own country, Zambia, had been independent 30 years in 1994, when South Africa won its independence. Nigeria had been independent for 34 years, and yet millions of Africans went to South Africa as soon as apartheid went down. Why is this? It is because South Africa was viewed as a developed country, an alternative to the trek to Europe. Before Africans started flooding South Africa, they had already flooded many other African countries, and many Africans had made the trek to Europe looking for a better life. This is something we have to look at before we understand the xenophobic violence in South Africa. Africa had been independent for 30 years before South Africa managed to regain its independence. And yet, millions of Africans fled to South Africa, just as they did to Kenya and to Morocco and Egypt and a lot of other African countries. There is a problem, and we have to understand this if we are going to solve what we now call xenophobic violence. Xenophobic violence in South Africa is a symptom, not the disease. The disease is the lack of infrastructure development in much of Africa. This is what caused the problem. I'll use my own country, Zambia, as an example in the 1990s. In the 1990s, Zambia was a mess, a total mess. The political situation was terrible. The economic situation was terrible. None of us could find jobs. A whole generation of Zambians left Zambia and moved to South Africa. And this happened in many other African countries. This put a great deal of strain on the black South Africans. And this is what caused the xenophobic attacks that are happening in South Africa today. Now, to give some credit to the African governments, a lot has happened in Africa since the 1990s. A road network has been built across Africa, which has helped with economic development. The Ethiopians have built and funded the Renaissance Dam, so progress has been made. And perhaps most importantly, the African Union now has a united army and a rapid deployment force, which has helped in reducing coups in Africa, and that rapid deployment force has helped to keep stability in a lot of African countries. These are not small developments. These are very important developments for the economic and political stability of the African people. And one of the reasons why South Africa has better infrastructure than the rest of Africa is because the apartheid governments and its predecessors had a jump start on the African governments. The apartheid governments had been building infrastructure in South Africa for at least 100 years before African governments got their independence. So that is one of the reasons why the infrastructure is still slightly ahead of the rest of Africa. But in the 30 years that Africa got independence before South Africa, much of the infrastructure should have been built, especially the electricity and clean running water. Those are the two things that in 30 years the African governments should have been able to achieve. To this day, much of Africa still does not have electricity, and without electricity, we cannot power our industries, and our people remain poor. Let us not forget that the Egyptian government managed to install 10,000 kilowatts of power in Egypt in 18 months. So, to be perfectly honest, 5 years is enough time to electrify the whole of Africa. It is these things that we must consider if we are to solve the problem of xenophobic violence in South Africa. And the solution to our problems will not be found in the West or in the Western media. To solve these problems, we must look at our own history and the way our African ancestors lived. The system of government and the system of land distribution is the key to solving these problems in South Africa and other African countries. Our ancestors lived in a system where everyone had a tribe, a village, and a family. When an African was old enough to start his own family, he was given land among his own tribe and his own village. People simply didn't migrate in large numbers unless they were going to trade or unless the migration was temporary. African countries must develop their own resources for their own people. This is what will solve the problem. The 30-year gap between the independence of Africa and South Africa was enough time to industrialize Africa. The Asians managed to do it. India has a large and rich middle class. Africa stumbled. But we must learn from our mistakes. And the sooner we start making these adjustments, the sooner we can pull our people out of poverty and make sure that the resources of Africa are used for the African people. These are developing our own places. This is what will stop xenophobic violence in South Africa and other African countries.